Picture this. It's 1864, and the Texas sun is beating down like a blacksmith's hammer on the dusty plains surrounding the rocking J Ranch. The heat isn't just uncomfortable, it's the kind of brutal, soul-crushing heat that makes men question their life choices. And speaking of questioning life choices, let me tell you about what passed for cattle roping in those days, because what you're about to hear will make modern safety regulations look like gentle suggestions. Samuel Morrison stood in the shade of his ranch house porch, watching his best roper, a tough-as-nails cowboy named Tommy Briggs, being carried off the field on a makeshift stretcher. Tommy's shoulder hung at an angle that nature never intended, the result of a 1,000-pound longhorn deciding that being roped was not on its agenda for the day. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. Now, to understand just how insane the traditional roping method was, imagine this. You're on horseback, charging at full gallop toward a wild longhorn bull that weighs about the same as a small automobile. You've got a stiff rope in your hands, and your brilliant plan is to throw a loop over the horns of an animal that can gore you, trample you, or simply decide to introduce your horse to the concept of weightlessness. The longhorns of 1864 weren't the docile cattle you might see at a petting zoo. These were essentially four-legged freight trains with horns and attitude problems. Morrison's ledgers told a story that would make any modern accountant weep. 30% of cattle lost or damaged during capture. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if nearly 1 in 3 products coming off an assembly line today were destroyed during the manufacturing process. The medical bills alone were eating profits faster than a swarm of locusts in a wheat field. Skilled ropers were becoming as rare as honest politicians, and word was spreading through the cowboy community faster than gossip at a church social. Working cattle the traditional way was a one-way ticket to the boneyard. The irony here is almost too perfect to believe. The very techniques that could have solved this crisis had been practiced for generations by Mexican vaqueros, those master horsemen who understood that patience and precision beat brute force every single time. But when Anglo cowboys took over the cattle business, they abandoned these time-tested methods in favor of what can only be described as organized chaos. It was like watching someone throw away a perfectly good map and decide to navigate by throwing rocks at street signs. As September 15th rolled around, Morrison was facing the kind of problem that keeps ranch owners awake at night. He had cattle to move, contracts to fulfill, and a dwindling crew of men willing to risk life and limb for cowboy wages. The booming cattle industry, which promised to transform the American economy, was threatening to collapse under the weight of its own brutality before it could properly begin. That's when something extraordinary happened. As the evening shadows began their daily march across the Texas plains, a solitary figure appeared at the ranch gate. He rode a paint horse with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in the saddle, but everything else about him seemed wrong for a cowboy. Where you'd expect swagger and bluster, this stranger carried himself with quiet dignity. Where you'd expect the usual collection of weapons and gear that marked a frontier tough, he had only a worn leather satchel that looked more suited to a traveling preacher than a ranch hand. Morrison later said his first instinct was to send the stranger on his way. The man looked more like a scholar who'd taken a wrong turn than someone who could handle the bone-crushing work of cattle ranching. But then the stranger said something that stopped Morrison cold. He claimed he could rope any bull on the ranch without breaking a sweat. Now, in 1864 Texas, claiming you could rope cattle without breaking a sweat was like claiming you could stop a charging buffalo with harsh language. It simply wasn't done. But there was something in the stranger's quiet confidence, something that made Morrison decide to see what this soft-spoken man could actually do. What happened next would change everything. The gathered cowboys watched in the kind of stunned silence, usually reserved for witnessing miracles or catastrophes, as the stranger approached the ranch's most notorious bull, a beast they called Diablo Rojo, Spanish for Red Devil. This animal had sent more cowboys to the doctor than all the others combined. Diablo Rojo was the kind of bull that made strong men reconsider their career choices and weak men find religion. But here's where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, except for the fact that too many witnesses saw it happen to dismiss it as frontier folklore. Using a peculiar wrist motion and a rope that seemed to move with its own intelligence, The stranger captured Diablo Rojo in under 2 minutes. His horse never broke from a trot. The bull, instead of fighting and thrashing like a creature possessed, simply accepted the rope as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The cowboys stood there like men who had just watched someone casually violate the laws of physics. This wasn't just a different technique, this was something that challenged everything they believed about how cattle and cowboys were supposed to interact. It was the marriage of ancient vaquero wisdom with what looked like sailor's precision, plus something entirely new that belonged to this mysterious stranger alone. Morrison hired him on the spot. The cowboys called him California Joe, though no one ever learned his real name. And as the dust settled on that September evening, none of them could have imagined that they had just witnessed the beginning of a revolution that would transform the entire American frontier. But here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. Who was California Joe, really? And how did a quiet stranger with a scholar's manner and a mysterious leather satchel manage to revolutionize an entire industry with nothing more than a rope and the kind of knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere? The answers, my friends, are about to get very interesting indeed. Now, if you think California Joe's demonstration with Diablo Rojo was impressive, wait until you hear what happened when he started teaching his methods to the Rocking J crew. Because what looked like simple rope work from a distance turned out to be something far more sophisticated, a complete reimagining of how humans and cattle could interact. The secret, Joe explained during those first evening gatherings around the chuck wagon, started with something called the Honda knot. Now, to the untrained eye, this looked like nothing special, just a small fixed loop at the rope's end that the rest of the lariat passed through to form the larger loop. Every cowboy knew about Honda knots. They'd been using them for years. But Joe's version contained subtle differences that transformed the entire rope from a crude snare into what he called a living tool. Think about the difference between a club and a surgeon's scalpel. Both can cut, but one requires brute force, while the other achieves precision through design and technique. That's exactly what Joe had done with the humble lariat. Where traditional cowboys threw wide, desperate loops and hoped for the best, essentially playing a violent game of chance with 1,000-pound animals, Joe's technique created something that could dance through the air, changing size and direction mid-flight like it was responding to his thoughts. Then came the houlihan throw, and this is where things get really interesting. Picture the traditional overhead throw that every cowboy knew, rope spinning above the head like a lasso in a Wild West show, then hurled forward in a flat trajectory. Joe's houlihan throw turned this completely upside down. Using an underhand motion, he sent the rope in a vertical wheel, rising up before dropping down over the animal's head with the precision of a falling leaf, finding its exact spot on the ground. Old Jake Williams, a 20-year veteran of the trail who'd seen every rope trick in the book, declared Joe's method unnatural and ungodly. Jake had the scars to prove his experience, rope burns that looked like lightning bolts across his palms, a shoulder that never quite healed right from a bull's revenge, and the kind of limp that spoke of too many close encounters with hooves. But even Jake had to admit the evidence of his own eyes when he watched Joe capture 5 steers in the time it took him to rope one using traditional methods. The evening gatherings around the chuck wagon became something unprecedented on the frontier actual classrooms. Joe possessed the rare gift of patience, teaching anyone willing to learn regardless of their experience level, and what he taught revealed layers of knowledge that went far beyond simple rope throwing. He showed them how to read an animal's intentions through the position of its ears, the way its tail moved, the subtle shifts in posture that telegraphed whether a steer was about to bolt left, right, or straight at you. Wind conditions mattered, Joe explained, matching rope weight to atmospheric conditions, like a sailor reading the sky for weather changes. A heavy rope in still air, a lighter one when the wind picked up details that separated the masters from the amateurs. He spoke of sacred patience, a concept inherited from vaquero traditions that recognized cattle as intelligent creatures capable of cooperation rather than just targets for conquest. Maria Gonzalez, the camp cook and daughter of a legendary vaquero named Don Carlos, recognized elements of her father's style in Joe's technique. But even she admitted seeing innovations that were completely new. "My father would spend hours teaching one throw," she told the gathered cowboys one evening, ladling beans onto their plates. This California Joe, he teaches the spirit behind all throws. It's like he took everything my father knew and added something from somewhere else entirely. Young cowboys, like 18-year-old Bill Patterson, practiced until their hands bled, driven by Joe's promise that skill could replace brute strength. Bill had joined the Rocking J crew straight from his family's hardscrabble farm, possessing more determination than experience. Under Joe's tutelage, he transformed from a liability into one of the most promising ropers on the ranch. It's not about overpowering the animal, Joe would tell him during those long practice sessions. It's about becoming part of the same dance. Even more remarkable was watching Margaret Morrison, Samuel's daughter, master the technique. In 1864, a woman working cattle was scandalous enough to set tongues wagging from San Antonio to Fort Worth. Margaret didn't just work cattle, she excelled at it, proving that Joe's emphasis on finesse over force opened doors that had been sealed by centuries of assumption about what cowboys needed to be. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but by autumn of 1865, something extraordinary was brewing. 5 ranches decided to combine their annual roundup, a massive undertaking that would test everything Joe had taught. Traditional roundups were exercises in controlled chaos, with injury rates that would make modern workplace safety inspectors faint. But Joe's students were about to demonstrate something that seemed impossible: 200 cattle processed daily with 0 serious injuries. Let me repeat that, because the numbers are almost too good to believe. 0 serious injuries. In an industry where broken bones were considered routine occupational hazards, Joe's methods had essentially eliminated the human cost of cattle work. The economic implications hit the ranchers like a thunderbolt. Operations using the new method could function with half the crew at twice the efficiency, but not everyone was celebrating this revolution. Change, even positive change, creates winners and losers. The traditional cowboys who had built their reputations on surviving the brutal old methods suddenly found their status threatened. Their scars and stories of survival, once badges of honor, seemed almost primitive compared to the elegant efficiency of Joe's techniques. The resistance crystallized around one man, Marcus "Bull" Henderson, a legendary figure who embodied everything the old style represented. Bull had earned his nickname through sheer physical dominance, overpowering cattle through strength and intimidation. He was the kind of cowboy that dime novels celebrated: tough, fearless, and utterly convinced that real men conquered animals through force of will. The confrontation between old and new was inevitable. Bull's challenge to California Joe wasn't just about proving whose method worked better. It was about defining what it meant to be a cowboy in the changing American West. The contest they arranged would settle the question once and for all, but the stakes were higher than anyone realized. Because what happened at Settlers Creek would determine whether the cattle industry embraced a new future or remained trapped in its violent past. And California Joe, that mysterious stranger with his quiet manner and revolutionary ideas, was about to face the ultimate test of everything he had taught. The entire frontier was watching, and the outcome would echo through generations of cowboys yet to come. The contest at Settlers Creek on October 20th, 1865, became the stuff of legend before the dust had even settled. Word spread through the territory like wildfire: Bull Henderson, the most feared and respected traditional roper in Texas, would face off against the mysterious California Joe in a head-to-head competition that would determine the future of cattle work. Cowboys rode in from ranches hundreds of miles away to witness what many expected to be Joe's humiliation. After all, Bull Henderson was a living legend. The man had roped cattle in blizzards that froze lesser men solid, worked drives through Comanche territory where staying in the saddle meant staying alive, and survived encounters with bulls that had killed other cowboys. His reputation was built on pure, uncompromising toughness, the kind that turned ordinary men into frontier heroes. The rules were simple. Most cattle roped in 2 hours wins. Judge would be Samuel Morrison himself, with timekeepers from 3 different ranches to ensure fairness. The cattle chosen were some of the wildest longhorns in Texas animals that had never felt a rope and had no intention of cooperating with human plans. What happened next challenged everything the assembled cowboys thought they knew about cattle, roping, and what it meant to be tough on the frontier. Bull Henderson attacked his task like a man at war. He charged at each steer with the fury of a cavalry officer leading a charge, his horse's hooves thundering across the dusty ground, while he spun his rope overhead with the kind of aggressive energy that had made him famous. Dust clouds marked every struggle as Henderson wrestled with animals that fought back with everything they had. Sweat soaked through his shirt within the first hour, and his horse began to foam at the mouth from the constant galloping and sudden stops. The violence was spectacular and exhausting. Henderson would rope a steer, then engage in what looked like a gladiatorial combat as the animal tried to break free. Sometimes he won quickly, other times the battle stretched on for precious minutes while the clock ticked away. His technique relied on overpowering each animal through sheer determination and physical strength, the cowboy equivalent of solving every problem with a bigger hammer. California Joe, by contrast, moved like water finding its path down a hillside. Where Henderson charged and fought, Joe flowed. His horse never broke from what appeared to be a casual trot, yet somehow he was always in exactly the right position. His rope seemed to float through the air rather than being thrown, settling over each steer's head with such gentle precision that the animals often seemed more puzzled than panicked. But here's the truly remarkable part. Joe didn't just rope the cattle, he calmed them. Instead of the wild struggles that marked Henderson's captures, Joe's steers would actually relax once they felt his rope. It was as if he communicated something to them through his technique, some message that said, "This doesn't have to be a fight." The crowd grew quieter as the contest progressed. What they had expected to be a celebration of traditional cowboy toughness was turning into something entirely different, a demonstration that perhaps they had been thinking about cattle work all wrong. When Henderson's count reached 15 steers after 2 exhausting hours, his horse was nearly foundered, and he looked like he'd been through a tornado. Joe's final count: 43 steers, captured with such effortless grace that he never even raised his voice. The moment Henderson extended his hand in defeat marked more than just the end of a contest. It was the old ways dying and the new being born. But Bull Henderson proved that day why some men become legends not just for their skill, but for their character. Instead of making excuses or challenging the results, he became one of Joe's most dedicated students, eventually teaching the new methods to cowboys across 3 states. Within 6 months, every major ranch from the Rio Grande to the Red River was demanding ropers trained in what they called California style. This created something unprecedented in the American West, the first professional training programs in frontier history. Ranches that had operated the same way for decades suddenly found themselves running schools, with experienced cowboys teaching newcomers the revolutionary techniques that California Joe had brought to Texas. The spring cattle drive of 1866 provided the ultimate test when Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving decided to push 2,000 head through Comanche territory toward the Colorado markets. This was the famous Goodnight-Loving Trail, one of the most dangerous routes in the West, where cattle thieves and hostile tribes made every mile a gamble with death. Joe rode point on that historic drive, having trained 30 cowboys who would need every skill to survive the journey ahead. When lightning stampeded the entire herd near the Pecos River, 2,000 panic-stricken cattle thundering through the darkness like a living avalanche, traditional methods would have meant catastrophe. Cowboys would have died trying to turn that stampede, and hundreds of cattle would have been lost over cliffs or drowned in the river. Instead, witnesses described what they called the dance of the lariats, Joe's trained ropers working in choreographed teams to turn the stampede without losing a single animal. They moved like musicians in an orchestra, each cowboy knowing exactly where the others would be, their ropes creating an invisible net that guided the panicked cattle back to safety. The success of that drive opened previously impossible routes, expanding the cattle empire into regions deemed too dangerous for profitable operations. Suddenly, ranchers could consider markets that had been economically unreachable, knowing that Joe's methods gave them the tools to move large herds through hostile territory with unprecedented safety and efficiency. By 1867, the technique had evolved beyond simple utility into genuine art form. Rodeo exhibitions in San Antonio featured ropers like Jose Martinez and Sarah Sal-McKenna performing tricks that Joe himself had never imagined. They caught horses mid-gallop, roped eagles in flight briefly, before releasing them unharmed, and created complex aerial patterns that left audiences speechless with wonder. The cultural fusion was complete. Mexican vaqueros and Anglo cowboys shared techniques freely, each group enriching the other's traditions in ways that strengthened both. Ranch foremen kept detailed journals documenting modifications and improvements, creating the first technical manuals of Western horsemanship. Knowledge that had once been passed down through generations by word of mouth was now being systematically recorded and refined. Yet even as his revolution transformed the entire frontier, California Joe grew restless. Cowboys noticed him spending long evenings staring at the horizon, speaking often of other ranges that need changing. He carried himself like a man who had finished one job and was already thinking about the next, though what that might be remained as mysterious as everything else about him. The man who had changed everything was preparing to disappear, leaving behind a transformed industry and 1,000 questions about who he really was and where he had learned the knowledge that revolutionized the American West. The legend of California Joe was about to enter its final, most mysterious chapter. California Joe vanished on Christmas Eve, 1867, leaving behind only a note written in his careful script. The gift is given, the seed is sown. By morning, his few possessions were gone, his paint horse was missing from the stable, and the most revolutionary figure in Western history had disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived. The theories about his departure spread faster than gossip at a church social. Some swore they saw him riding south toward the Mexican border, perhaps returning to vaquero roots that might explain his extraordinary knowledge. Others claimed to have spotted him boarding a ship in Galveston, bound for destinations unknown, maybe returning to whatever ocean had taught him about ropes and knots with such supernatural precision. But the most intriguing theory came from Margaret Morrison, who claimed until her death in 1923 that California Joe was actually Josephine, a woman who had disguised herself to teach in a man's world. Margaret pointed to evidence that others had overlooked. Joe's unusually small hands, his gentle manner with both horses and cattle, and most tellingly, his complete lack of interest in the drinking, gambling, and fighting that occupied most cowboys during their leisure time. A woman would understand, Margaret insisted during interviews late in her life, that strength isn't about overpowering something weaker than yourself. It's about finding harmony where others see only conflict. Whether she was right remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American frontier, but her theory adds another layer to the enigma of California Joe's true identity. What made the mystery even deeper was the complete absence of any historical record. When researchers in the 1920s began investigating Joe's background, they discovered something impossible. No ranch from California to Texas could produce records of employing anyone matching his description before 1864. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air, revolutionized an entire industry, and vanished back into legend. Some historians suggest he might have been a deserter from the Civil War, using skills learned in the military to reinvent himself on the frontier. Others propose he was a merchant sailor who had jumped ship in Galveston and made his way inland, bringing maritime knowledge of knots and ropes to the cattle industry. The most romantic theory holds that he was a Native American who had learned both vaquero traditions and something else entirely, creating a synthesis of cultures that transformed the West. But regardless of who California Joe really was, the revolution he sparked was undeniably real and measurably transformative. By 1870, the American cattle industry had doubled its output while reducing workplace casualties by 90%. Think about those numbers for a moment. Imagine any modern industry achieving such dramatic improvements in both productivity and safety in just 6 years. It's the kind of transformation that typically takes decades to accomplish. The Professional Ropers Association, founded in 1872, standardized Joe's techniques into a formal curriculum taught from Montana to Arizona. Cowboys who once faced the constant threat of career-ending injuries now enjoyed long, productive careers, passing their skills to children and grandchildren who would carry the knowledge into the 20th century and beyond. The economic impact reached staggering proportions by 1880, over $50 million in increased efficiency, a fortune that helped build the towns, schools, and infrastructure of the American West. That money didn't just disappear into ranch owners' pockets. It circulated through entire communities, creating prosperity that lifted the entire region. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Joe's legacy is how it continues to influence the modern world. Champions like 8-time world champion Trevor Brazile still study Joe's basic principles, finding new applications in everything from wild horse management to Hollywood stunt work. The fundamental insights about patience, precision, and cooperation over force remain as relevant today as they were in 1864. The Vaquero Heritage Museum in San Antonio displays 3 different ropes claimed to be California Joe's originals, though scientific tests prove that all were manufactured years after his disappearance. It seems that the legend has become so powerful that people need physical artifacts to anchor their connection to the story, even when those artifacts are clearly modern reproductions. Each December 24th, cowboys across the American West still practice what they call the Christmas Eve throw, a complicated aerial pattern that Joe allegedly performed on his last night at the Rocking J Ranch. Whether he actually demonstrated this particular technique or whether it developed later as part of his growing legend doesn't really matter. The ritual serves as a way for modern cowboys to maintain their connection to the mysterious figure who transformed their profession. The tradition includes a moment of silence for the teacher who came and went, followed by attempts to recreate the intricate rope pattern that supposedly summons Joe's spirit back to the range. No one claims it actually works, but the practice continues because it represents something deeper than simple nostalgia. It's a recognition that some individuals carry knowledge so powerful it can change the world. And maybe that's the real truth about California Joe. Maybe it doesn't matter whether he was Mexican, Anglo, Native American, male, female, or something else entirely. Maybe what matters is the deeper truth he proved through his brief time on the Texas frontier. That one person with a better way can transform an entire industry, then vanish into legend, leaving only the echo of rope singing through air and the memory of impossible grace. The techniques he taught live on in every modern rodeo, every working ranch, every place where humans and animals cooperate instead of fighting. His legacy flows through generations of cowboys who learned that gentleness achieves more than force, that innovation can honor tradition, and that knowledge shared freely returns multiplied beyond imagination. In the end, California Joe became something more valuable than any individual person could be. He became an idea. The idea that there's always a better way waiting to be discovered, that tradition and innovation can work together instead of against each other, and that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is treat others, whether human or animal, with respect instead of dominance. So the next time you see a cowboy working cattle with quiet efficiency instead of violent struggle, or watch a rodeo performer execute a throw with balletic precision, or hear about any innovation that makes dangerous work safer and more effective, remember the ghost of the Golden Loop. Remember California Joe, whoever he really was, and the truth he taught. That the best revolutions don't destroy the past, they fulfill its highest possibilities. The seed he sowed continues to grow, and somewhere in the vast American West, his spirit rides on.